Hey guys, welcome to Bite Size Tactics Lab. This video is for Age of Wonders Planetfall and it's 10 tactical tips. So these are just going to be 10 kind of quick and short demonstrations of things that I think are important to consider when you want to try to become a little more effective in tactical combat in Planetfall. So obviously pretty much everything in the game boils down to what unfolds in the tactical combat layer. Obviously there's diplomacy, the strategic layer, base development, and empire building to be done, but by and large, the game boils down to what are you able to accomplish in tactical combat. So it's clearly not only I think the most fun part of the game, most interesting part of the game, but also the most important. So this is just a list of tips that can hopefully be kind of easily explained and are appropriate for beginners or mid-level players, and some kind of demonstrations and things where it's appropriate, but it's not going to be about in-depth game mechanics, systems, units, abilities, factions, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of once you've gotten your feet wet a bit and you want to get a little bit better at thinking about tactical combat, this is maybe a good place to start. So let's get into the list here. Starting off with number 1, positioning armies on the strategic map saves positioning on the tactical map. So this can be very handy to save yourself a bunch of time, but also set up certain units such as flanking and flying units to give them a positional advantage right from the very first turn in combat. So let's take a quick look at a video here. You're going to see I've split up 2 armies here, an assault bike and 2 owls at one end, and then sort of an infantry focused army at the other end. We're already pincering the enemy on the strategic map, so once we get into tactical combat, you'll see we're already sort of, the enemy's pinched between us here, so it's going to be very easy to get chain flanking attacks in and really just surround the enemy right from the start. We don't have to fiddle around with trying to slide units from one side to the other of the map, which can oftentimes take a lot of time, but also isn't necessarily easy to do in some situations either. So very useful thing to try and mess around with a bit, especially for flanking and flying units, which I've mentioned. But so yeah, something to think about. So number 2, plan ahead for tactical operations. Now, so this one, it's easy to forget that these things cost energy, especially for the higher tier ones. It can get a little bit expensive. So if you're about to do large-scale combat, make sure you have energy in reserves in order to fund your operations. Also, be aware that when you queue up units, I don't believe this happens for buildings, but when you queue up units, it actually takes the energy out of your bank up front. So if you've got a couple of colonies set up and you start queuing up a whole bunch of units that you want to build, you might get into tactical combat and realize, oh crap, I have no energy to use to actually fire off my tactical ops. So easy mistake to make. It's something you got to pay a little bit of attention to, especially if you plan to use a lot of tactical ops. So number 3 is another easy one. It's all about the combat log. So in the top right of your screen when you're in tactical combat, there's a button you can toggle on this log here, and it's going to give you combat history. Basically what you're going to see in here is a breakdown of all the actions that have been taken on your turn and the enemy's turn. So it gives you a little bit insight too into sort of what the RNG is doing, but it's very useful. Once you're kind of familiar with how the game works, this is a good way to sort of look under the hood as far as what's happening from turn to turn. The other thing, there's a couple other things I like this for. One is it's easy to remember what you've done on your turn, but on the enemy's turn, sometimes it can be hard to remember what skills they've used. And certainly for enemy units that have skills on cooldowns, it's easier to kind of remember back or look back into this combat history to see what they did versus trying to remember, okay, did he use this skill or that skill to hurt me last turn? And do I have to plan for his next skill to hit again, or is it on cooldown or whatever? So it's a little bit easier to find it this way. The other thing is in situations where there's a lot of actions happening quickly, especially in melee combat, this can be kind of hard to discern what's happening or what the sequence of events that's happening without the combat history turned on, because basically you just see the animations and the info bubbles pop up, but it goes away very quickly. If you're not paying close attention, sometimes it's hard to tell what exactly transpired. So this is just another easy way to keep track of all that stuff. So those first 3, very easy, very straightforward things to be aware of. So up number 4 here, tip number 4, order of operations. It's extremely important. So what I consider order of operations, kind of like math. Anybody that's taken basic algebra or math classes, you know, there's kind of a sequence of what order you want to do things to. And the idea behind this is usually you want to plan what your units are going to do, all of your units, before you even move any of them. And the whole idea behind this is to kind of make sure that you're not going to get yourself in your own way. You're not going to end up putting your own units in the way to block ranged attacks or get hit by collateral damage or prevent movement where you want, you might want to move a support unit somewhere so that it can heal another unit, but you end up doing it at the end of your turn and realizing that unit's out of range, so on and so forth. Basically, try to plan ahead and consider your order of operations. As an example here, I'm going to pop up a quick video. So we've got our hero unit here. He's tangled up with 2 enemy melee units. They're both in melee Overwatch. Now, before I even do anything with my hero, I want to make sure I get a chance to try to stagger those 2 and get them out of melee Overwatch. Now, once I've done that, now that I'm just against a one-on-one situation here, I can attack the guy that's still in melee Overwatch, and you'll see in the combat log, I'm going to stagger him, breaking his melee Overwatch, and then hitting him a couple more times there, which is really nice. Now, if I had done that first, before I went in and threw the grenade, I would have gotten countered by the other unit who was still in melee Overwatch and been staggered and basically missed out on my attack. So I would have taken more damage and dealt less damage there. So just an obvious example. But definitely pay attention to the order of which you're doing things. So next up is, it kind of goes with the same notion of number 4 here, is pathing for movement. So units, both friendly and enemies, block pathing for movement. So you can kind of use this to body block enemies and choke points, but also can end up backfiring and inadvertently prevent your own units from going where you'd like them to. So you have to plan ahead for this. There's a few different ways to understand this, and actually going into number 6 here, tip number 6, click on enemy units for information about their movement, skills, including cooldowns, and if you hit 2, you can see which direction the enemy is facing here. So here's an example. We can see we've got this enemy units highlighted here. You'll see, just like when you select your own units, you get an idea of what the movement range is, what skills they have available, what's on cooldown. All the effects are right in there. So if you take time, and especially for some of the more valuable or dangerous enemies that you're facing, you want to kind of make a habit out of clicking on these guys and seeing what they're doing. Also, for which direction the unit's facing. And some of the unit models are really hard to tell sometimes which direction the unit's facing in. So in some cases, it can be a little counterintuitive because you think the unit's facing one ways, and then you find out once you go to submit an attack, you'll realize, oh crap, it's actually facing the other way. I didn't realize that. So by clicking on the enemy, hitting 2, you'll find out which way they're facing. It'll be a dark green line of hexes, very easy to recognize, and kind of a good habit to get into. So for number 7 here, understand the types of cover in the game. Use the Q and E keys to spin your camera around the map to get a sense of firing angles, choke points, and basically just a better sense of what exactly you're dealing with on the map. There's quite a few different types of cover that are in the game. There's things that will blow up if you destroy them. There's cover that's fortified, meaning it needs to be demolished. Only demolisher abilities will actually do damage to it. There's environmental effects that you have to consider. Lots of stuff going on with the maps. It's actually one of the cool parts of the game is how well detailed these maps are. So here's an example of similar situation to what we saw before. In this case, I'm going to use my grenade ability, which is does tons of extra damage to cover. Also has the demolisher ability. By taking out all that cover on that section of the map, now I can swing another unit around. And in this case, I'm going to throw a second grenade, blowing up an explosive barrel, getting a stagger and damage from my grenade, and also thermal damage from those explosive barrels that were near that enemy. So, even on the most simple maps, if you look around, you'll start to see what sort of cover is important. Some cover only will block line of sight entirely. Some will just serve as basic cover for units to get behind. It's quite a bit to get used to, but once you kind of recognize how the game likes to portray it, it actually becomes kind of straightforward, and you can find interesting ways to combine, abilities and stuff to do cool things with it. So let's keep moving on here. That was number 7. Let's go to the last slide here, number 8. So we talked about breaking melee Overwatch, which I demonstrated with that. I'll pull up the video again. with grenades, using the stagger on the grenade effect to break up a melee overwatch ability here. You almost always want to do this. It's almost always worth doing this. If we have any units that are nearby that are tied up in melee overwatch, especially if they're outnumbered in that situation, it's almost always worth using a skill or ability that you may have to break that status. Melee overwatch is really, really good. It's underrated in many cases. Just because it's not really flashy, it doesn't come with cool animations or really anything much interesting, but it's a very effective way of pinning down units and dealing tons of damage. So anytime you can, when the opportunity presents itself and you need to, break melee overwatch. The whole point of doing so is you want to have the sort of initiative in the stagger game, just like I demonstrated in that video, to do more damage while taking less damage from the enemies, because you want your melee heroes or units to be hitting first, applying stagger when they can, doing damage when they can. That way, when it's the enemy's turn and he has less action points to use because you've already staggered him, you're basically going to keep that initiative through the rest of the combat. For number 9, control key on your keyboard when you're hovering over targets provides a lot of information about the target, modifiers for accuracy, the armor and shields that the unit has, etc. Let's pull up a quick example here. So just as an example, an OWL unit that's flanking this Quartzite Liquid Flame unit here, you get a bunch of info on it. So how much hit points does it have? It's got 3 shields, which is why I'm doing relatively small amounts of damage on this thermal channel here. It's also thermal resistant, which I can see. You can see the cover penalties that I'm forced to pay here, long range penalty, etc. But so there's quite a bit of information that's provided just by hitting that control key over the unit when you're right before you make an attack. So a great way to learn more, get more insight into some of the game mechanics, and also if you get in the habit of doing this, you'll find out that oftentimes there's better ways to do what you originally planned to do once you take more things into consideration that you otherwise might have skipped over. So let's go to the last thing. This is an obvious one, but again, it's sort of almost a habit that you want to build. You want to pay attention to the way your units are facing after they take their last action. So, and you can't always avoid this, but it's kind of, you just want to get in the habit of understanding after you take your sequence of events here with your units, which way are they going to be facing? You don't want to leave anybody hanging out to dry here. Here's just an example from earlier in this same combat where I'm moving my hero, I'm positioning him with rotate to make sure he's facing the direction I expect the enemies to come from. I'm also queuing up my Vanguard Pug here, using the Obscure on him, but I'm doing so in a way that all my units are facing the direction of the enemy. I'm not leaving myself exposed, getting my units turned around backwards for no reason. It can be, sometimes, like I said, there's times when you won't be able to avoid this happening, but once you get in the habit of doing, especially if you're using defensive mode or just moving units around and not using the full 3 action points on movement, you always want to remember to rotate the units and put some thought into which way you expect there to be conflict from. So like in this case, I've got cover on my right side here behind my hero, so I know that I kind of want to be facing off to the left because there's almost little to no chance that even if just one enemy comes all the way around my right side, he's only going to be able to do maybe 1 attack, which isn't going to do a ton of damage versus the 2 enemies that are on the left, which is the way that I'd expect to potentially take more damage, or 3 enemies, I guess, over there. So, but that's pretty much it, guys. That's the video. Those are 10 different tactical tips. They're all kind of basic, but can be used in combination and habit building and stuff like that to hopefully make you be more effective with tactical combat and also get more out of it. A couple other things I will add is, which I've said in previous videos, definitely experiment with tactical combat. Try using units that you don't normally use. Try using different combinations of units or mods or equipment. Try using less units than you need to win a tactical combat. Just experiment. You'll be surprised what you can do in this game once you sort of start to read between the lines a bit and understand really how well things can synergize or not synergize. But it's a lot of fun. That's really what makes this game really fun. That's why I enjoy it so much. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching and good luck in your tactical combat.